Chapter 1. First mission to London, 1757 to 1762. We safely arrived in England on the 17th of July, 1757, after having been chased several times on our passage by privateers. But we outsailed everything, and in 30 days had good soundings. We met with no accident except the night before our arrival, when we narrowly escaped running ashore on the rocks of Scilly, owing to our not having discovered the lights ashore till it was almost too late to avoid them. The bell ringing for church, we went thither immediately, and with hearts full of gratitude, returned sincere thanks to God for the mercies we had received. Were I a Roman Catholic, perhaps I should on this occasion have vowed to build a chapel to some saint. But as I am not, if I were to vow at all, it should have been to build a lighthouse. My son and I arrived in London the 27th of July. Having settled lodging near Charing Cross, I found many amusements there to pass the time agreeably. 'Tis true, the regard and friendship I met with from persons of worth, and the conversation of ingenious men, gave me no small pleasure. But at that time of life, domestic comforts afforded the most solid satisfaction, and my uneasiness at being absent from my family and longing desire to be with them made me often sigh in the midst of cheerful company. At Craven Street in Westminster, everything about us was pretty genteel. We had 4 rooms furnished, but living in London was in every respect very expensive. The hackney coaches at the end of the town, where most people kept their own, was the worst in the whole city. Miserable, dirty, broken, shabby things, unfit to go into when dressed clean, and such as one would be ashamed to get out of at any gentleman's door. The whole town was one great smoky house, and every street a chimney, the air full of floating sea-coal soot, and you never got a sweet breath of what was pure without riding some miles for it into the country. As to burning wood, it answered no end, unless one could furnish all one's neighbors and the whole city with the same. I slept in a short calico bedgown with close sleeves and flannel close-footed trousers, for without them I got no warmth at night. I found that every time I walked out, I got fresh cold. My illness continued nearly 8 weeks. I had a violent cold and something of a fever. I was now and then a little delirious. They cupped me on the back of the head, which seemed to ease me for a while. I took a great deal of bark, both in substance and infusion, and too soon thinking myself well, I ventured out twice to do a little business and forward the service I was engaged in, and both times got fresh cold and fell down again. I took so much bark in various ways that I began to abhor it. I durst not take a vomit for fear of my head, but at last I was seized one morning with a vomiting and purging, the latter of which continued the greater part of the day. My good doctor grew very angry with me for acting so contrary to his cautions and directions, and obliged me to promise more observance for the future. He attended me very carefully and affectionately, and the good lady of the house, Mrs. Stevenson, nursed me kindly. Billy was also of great service to me in going from place to place where I could not go myself, and my servant Peter was very diligent and attentive. Yet I have 1,000 times wished my wife with me, and my little Sally with her ready hands and feet to do, and go and come, and get what I wanted. There is a great difference in sickness being nursed with that tender attention which proceeds from sincere love. My friend Mr. Strahan offered to lay me a considerable wager that a letter he wrote to my wife would bring her immediately over to England. He fancied his rhetoric and art would certainly bring her over, but I was sure there was no inducement strong enough to prevail with her to cross the seas. I spent an evening in conversation with him on the subject. He was very urgent with me to stay in England and prevail with my wife to remove thither with Sally. He proposed several advantageous schemes to me which appeared reasonably founded. His family was a very agreeable one. Mrs. Strawn, a sensible and good woman, the children of amiable characters, and particularly the young man, who was sober, ingenious, and industrious, and a desirable person. In point of circumstances, there could be no objection, Mr. Strawn being in so thriving a way as to lay up £1,000 every year from the profits of his business, after maintaining his family and paying all the charges. But I gave him 2 reasons why I could not think of removing thither. 1, my affection to Pennsylvania, and long-established friendships and connections there. The other, my wife's invincible aversion to crossing the seas. I mentioned to my wife another of my fancyings, namely a pair of silk blankets, very fine. They were of a new kind, just taken in a French prize, privateering, and such as were never seen in England before. They were called blankets, but I thought would be very neat to cover a summer bed instead of a quilt or counterpane. While in London, I had several trunks of silk consigned to me for sale, and I remember it fetched at a public sale as high a price within 6pence in the pound weight as the Italian sold at the same time. I had not the least doubt but that, by perseverance, this valuable produce could be established in our province in America. And in my journey from Philadelphia to Boston in the summer of 1763, I had the pleasure of meeting with sundry persons in different places who were attempting the production of silk from the encouragement of the Society of Arts. Once recovered from my long illness, I found myself engaged in an affair that took much more time than I expected. The repeated exemptions of the Penns, proprietors of Pennsylvania, from bearing a part of our colony's heavy taxes appeared unreasonable to those who bore the burden of the American War, where our proprietaries had so large an interest to defend, as well as for the more immediate defense of their own estates. I insisted on a conference with the proprietaries. Mr. Thomas Penn stated that we, the Pennsylvania Assembly, were only a kind of corporation acting by a charter from the Crown and could have no privileges or rights but what was granted by that charter, in which no such privilege as we then claimed was anywhere mentioned. "But," said I, "your father's charter expressly says that the Assembly of Pennsylvania shall have all the power and privileges of an assembly according to the rights of the freeborn subjects of England, and as is usual in any of the British plantations in America." "Yes," said he, "but if my father granted privileges he was not by the royal charter empowered to grant, nothing can be claimed by such a grant." I said, "If then your father had no right to grant the privileges he pretended to grant, and to publish all over Europe as granted, then those who came to settle in the province upon the faith of that grant and in expectation of enjoying the privileges contained in it were deceived, cheated, and betrayed." He answered, "They should have themselves looked to that. The royal charter was no secret. They who came into the province on my father's offer of privileges, if they were deceived, it was their own fault." And that he said with a kind of triumphing, laughing insolence, such as a low jockey might do when a purchaser complained that he had cheated him in a horse. I was astonished to see him thus meanly give up his father's character, and conceived that moment a more cordial and thorough contempt for him than I had ever before felt for any man living, a contempt that I cannot express in words, but I believe my countenance expressed it strongly. His brother was looking at me and must have observed it. I reported to the Assembly that a petition expressing their dislike to the proprietary government and praying the Crown to get rid of the proprietary government and take the province under its immediate government and protection would be very favorably heard. Of myself, having no longer any hopes of an accommodation, I have never since desired an audience of the proprietaries. I depend chiefly on journeys into the country for the establishment of my health. In the summer of 1758, as all the great folks were out of town and public business at a stand, Billy and I traveled over a great part of England. We took a journey to Cambridge, being entertained with great kindness by the principal people and shown all the curiosities of the place. I found the journey advantageous to both my health and spirits. We were present at all the commencement ceremonies, dined every day in their halls, and my vanity was not a little gratified by the particular regard shown me by the Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor of the University and heads of colleges. While at Cambridge, I mentioned in conversation with Dr. John Hadley, professor of chemistry, an experiment for cooling bodies by evaporation that I had, by repeatedly wetting the thermometer with common spirits, brought the mercury down 5 or 6 degrees. Dr. Hadley proposed repeating the experiments with ether instead of common spirits, as the ether is much quicker in evaporation. We accordingly went to his chamber, where he had both ether and a thermometer. By dipping first the ball of the thermometer into the ether, it appeared that the ether was precisely of the same temperament with the thermometer, which stood then at 65, for it made no alteration in the height of the little column of mercury. But when the thermometer was taken out of the ether and the ether with which the ball was wet began to evaporate, the mercury sank several degrees. The wetting was then repeated by a feather which had been dipped into the ether when the mercury sunk still lower. We continued this operation, one of us wetting the ball and another of the company blowing on it with the bellows to quicken the evaporation, the mercury sinking all the time till it came down to 7, which is 25 degrees below the freezing point when we left off. Soon after it passed the freezing point, a thin coat of ice began to cover the ball. Whether this water collected or condensed by the coldness of the ball, from the moisture in the air, or from our breath, or whether the feather, when dipped into the ether, might not sometimes go through it and bring up some of the water that was under it, I was not certain. The ice continued increasing till we ended the experiment, when it appeared near 1/4 of an inch thick all over the ball, with a number of small specula pointing outwards. From this experiment, one may see the possibility of freezing a man to death on a warm summer's day if he were to stand in a passage through which the wind blew briskly and to be wet frequently with ether, a spirit that is more inflammable than brandy or common spirits of wine. It is but within these few years that the European philosophers seem to have known this power in nature of cooling bodies by evaporation. Even our common sailors seem to have had some notion of this property. I remember that, being at sea when I was a youth, I observed one of the sailors during a calm in the night, often wetting his finger in his mouth and then holding it up in the air to discover, as he said, if the air had any motion and from which side it came. And this he expected to do by finding one side of his finger grow suddenly cold, and from that side he should look for the next wind, which I then laughed at as a fancy. During the hot Sunday at Philadelphia in June 1750, when the thermometer was up at 100 in the shade, I sat in my chamber without exercise, only reading or writing, with no other clothes on than a shirt and a pair of long linen drawers, the windows all open, and a brisk wind blowing through the house, the sweat running off the backs of my hands, and my shirt was often so wet as to induce me to call for dry ones to put on. But my body never grew so hot as the air that surrounded it, or the inanimate bodies immersed in the same air. May this not be a reason why our reapers in Pennsylvania, working in the open field in the clear hot sunshine common in our harvest time, find themselves well able to go through that labor without being much incommoded by the heat while they continue to sweat, and while they supply matter for keeping up that sweat by drinking frequently of a thin evaporable liquor, water mixed with rum. But if the sweat stops, they drop, and sometimes die suddenly if the sweating is not again brought on by drinking that liquor, or, as some rather choose in that case, a kind of hot punch made of water mixed with honey and a considerable proportion of vinegar. Billy and I traveled over a great part of England, and among other places, visited the town my father was born in and found some relations in that part of the country still living, Thomas Franklin in Leicestershire, and his daughter Sally Franklin, who later lived with me in London. We went to Ecton, being the village where my father was born, and where his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had lived. We went first to see the old house and grounds. The land is now added to another farm and a school kept in the house. It is a decayed old stone building, but still known by the name of Franklin House. Thence we went to visit the rector of the parish, who lives close by the church, a very ancient building. He entertained us very kindly and showed us the old church register, in which were the births, marriages, and burials of our ancestors for 200 years, recorded as early as his book began. His wife, a good-natured, chatty old lady, remembered a great deal about the family. She entertained and diverted us highly with stories of Thomas Franklin, who was a conveyancer, something of a lawyer, clerk of the county court, and clerk to the archdeacon in his visitations. A very leading man in all county affairs, and much employed in public business. He set on foot a subscription for erecting chimes in their steeple, and completed it, and we heard them play. He found out an easy method of saving their village meadows from being drowned, as they used to be sometimes by the river, which method is still in being. When first proposed, nobody could conceive how it could be, but however, they said, if Franklin says he knows how to do it, it will be done. His advice and opinion was sought for on all occasions by all sorts of people, and he was looked upon, she said, by some as something of a conjurer. He died just 4 months before I was born. While there, I came across a little book called None But Christ, presented by an old Uncle Josiah to his daughter Jane. I sent the following poem from the book to my sister Jane, which for namesake's sake, as well as the good advice it contains, I transcribed. Illuminated from on high, and shining brightly in your sphere, ne'er faint, but keep a steady eye, expecting endless pleasures there. Flee vice as you'd a serpent flee, raise faith and hope 3 stories higher, and let Christ's endless love to thee ne'er cease to make thy love aspire. Kindness of heart by words express, let your obedience be sincere. In prayer and praise your God address, ne'er cease till he can cease to hear. After professing truly that I have a great esteem and veneration for the pious author, permit me a little to play the commentator and critic on these lines. Faith, hope, and charity have been called the 3 steps of Jacob's ladder, reaching from earth to heaven. The author calls them stories, likening religion to a building, and those the 3 stories of the Christian edifice. Faith is then the ground floor. Hope is up 1 pair of stairs. My advice: don't delight so much to dwell in these lower rooms, but get as fast as you can into the garret, for in truth the best room in the house is charity. For my part, I wish the house was turned upside down. 'Tis so difficult, when one is fat, to get upstairs. And not only so, but I imagine hope and faith may be more firmly built on charity than charity upon faith and hope. However that be, I think it is better reading to say, raise faith and hope 1 story higher. Correct it boldly, and I'll support the alteration. For when you are up 2 stories already, if you raise your building 3 stories higher, you will make 5 in all, which is 2 more than there should be. You expose your upper rooms to the winds and storms, and besides, I am afraid the foundation will hardly bear them, unless indeed you build with such light stuff as straw and stubble, and that, you know, won't stand fire. Again, where the author says, kindness of heart by words express, strike out words and put in deeds. The world is too full of compliments already. They are the rank growth of every soil and choke the good plants of benevolence. Nor do I pretend to be the first in this comparison of words and actions to plants. An ancient poet whose words we have all studied and copied at school said long ago, "A man of words and not of deeds is like a garden full of weeds." 'Tis pity that good works among some sorts of people are so little valued, and good words admired in their stead. I mean seemingly pious discourses instead of humane benevolent actions. These they almost put out of countenance by calling morality rotten morality, righteousness ragged righteousness, and even filthy rags. And when you mention virtue, they pucker up their noses as if they smelt a stink. At the same time, they eagerly snuff up an empty canting harangue as if it was a posy of the choicest flowers. So they have inverted the good old verse and say now, "A man of deeds and not of words is like a garden full of..." I have forgot the rhyme, but remember, 'tis something the very reverse of a perfume. No part of our journey afforded us a more pleasing remembrance than Scotland. The many civilities, favors, and kindnesses heaped upon us while we were there made the most lasting impressions on our minds and have endeared that country to us beyond express. On the whole, I must say, I think the time we spent there was 6 weeks of the densest happiness I have met with in any part of my life. And the agreeable and instructive society we found there in such plenty has left so pleasing an impression on my memory that did not strong connections draw me elsewhere, I believe Scotland would be the country I should choose to spend the remainder of my days in. The following February, I was honored to receive a doctorate of laws from the University of St. Andrews at Edinburgh, the oldest university in Scotland, for my inventions and experiments in electricity, and another doctorate of civil law from Oxford University in 1762 that was conferred the summer following. Returning to London, I was grieved to learn that 2 of the former members of the junto had departed this life, Stephen Potts and William Parsons. Odd characters, both of them. Parsons, a wise man that often acted foolishly. Potts, a wit that seldom acted wisely. If enough were the means to make a man happy, one had always the means of happiness without ever enjoying the thing. The other had always the thing without ever possessing the means. Parsons, even in his prosperity, always fretting. Potts, in the midst of his poverty, ever laughing. It seems, then, that happiness in this life rather depends on internals than externals, and that, besides the natural effects of wisdom and virtue, vice and folly, there is such a thing as being of a happy or unhappy constitution. They were both friends and loved us. They had their virtues as well as their foibles. They were both honest men, and that alone, as the world goes, is one of the greatest of characters. They were old acquaintances in whose company I formerly enjoyed a great deal of pleasure, and I cannot think of losing them without concern and regret. For my own part, I find I love company, chat, a laugh, a glass, and even a song as well as ever. and at the same time relish better than I used to do the grave observations and wise sentences of old men's conversations. Death begins to make breaches in the little junto of old friends, and it must be expected he will soon pick us all off, one after another. I therefore have always hoped that it would not be discontinued as long as we are able to crawl together. Loss of friends and near and dear relatives is one of the taxes we pay for the advantage of long life, and a heavy tax it is. In April 1759, it gave me great pleasure to learn that the bill taxing the proprietary estate would pass. A few months later, a book relating to the affairs of Pennsylvania was published. In it, the author wrote, "And who or what are these proprietaries? In the province, unsizable subjects and insufficient lords. At home, gentlemen, it is true, but gentlemen so very private that in the herd of gentry they are hardly to be found. Not in court, not in office, not in Parliament." The proprietor, Mr. Penn, was enraged. When I met him anywhere, there appeared in his wretched countenance a strange mixture of hatred, anger, fear, and vexation. He supposed me to be the author, but was mistaken. I had no hand in it. I looked over the manuscript, but was not permitted to alter everything I did not fully approve. And, upon the whole, I think it was a work that was of good use in England, by giving the Parliament and Ministry a clearer knowledge and truer notion of our disputes, and of lasting use in Pennsylvania, as it afforded a close and connected view of our public affairs. On these accounts, I agreed to encourage the publication by engaging for the expense. After my chief business was over, I amused myself with the contriving and bringing to a considerable degree of perfection a new musical instrument which has afforded me and my friends a great deal of pleasure. As it is an instrument that seems peculiarly adapted to Italian music, especially that of the soft and plaintive kind, I have called it the harmonica. This instrument is played upon by sitting before the middle of the set of glasses as before the keys of a harpsichord, turning them with the foot and wetting them now and then with a sponge and clean water. The fingers should first be a little soaked in water and quite free from all greasiness. A little fine chalk upon them is sometimes useful to make them catch the glass and bring out the tone more readily. Both hands are used, by which means different parts are played together. The advantages of the instrument are that its tones are incomparably sweet beyond those of any other, that they may be swelled and softened at pleasure by stronger or weaker pressures of the finger and continued to any length, and that the instrument, being once well tuned, never again wants tuning. From the summer of 1761 till toward the end of September, I took the opportunity of the vacation of business in the public office in London to make a tour of Holland and Flanders with my son. When I traveled in Flanders, I thought of the excessively strict observation of Sunday in Connecticut, and that a man could hardly travel on that day without hazard of punishment. While where I was in Flanders, everyone traveled if he pleased, or diverted himself any other way, and in the afternoon, both high and low went to the play or the opera, where there was plenty of singing, fiddling, and dancing. I looked round for God's judgments, but saw no signs of them. The cities were well built and full of inhabitants, the markets filled with plenty, the people well favored and well clothed, the fields well tilled, the cattle fat and strong, the fences, houses, and windows all in repair, and no old tenor anywhere in the country, which would almost make one suspect that the deity is not so angry at that offense as a New England justice. Having seen almost all the principal places and things worth notice in those two countries, we returned to London, arriving in time to witness the coronation of the new king. My business being complete, I made plans to return home to Philadelphia. I nevertheless regretted extremely the leaving of a country in which I received so much friendship and friends whose conversations were so agreeable and so improving to me. And thus, in the summer of 1762, I departed the old world for the new, leaving Billy behind a little longer. I fancied a little like dying saints who part with those they love in this world, grief at the parting, fear of the passage, hope of the future. I had in America connections of the most engaging kind, and happy as I had been in the friendships contracted in this happy island, those in America promised me greater and more lasting felicity. I have long been of the opinion that the foundations of the future grandeur and stability of the British Empire lie in America, and though, like other foundations, they are low and little seen, they are nevertheless broad and strong enough to support the greatest political structure human wisdom ever yet erected. Chapter 2. My return to Philadelphia, 1762 to 1764. I left England about the end of August 1762 in company with 10 sail of merchant ships under convoy of a man of war to protect us against the French. We had a pleasant passage to Madeira, an island and colony belonging to Portugal, where we were kindly received and entertained, our nation being then in high honor with them on account of the protection it was at that time affording their mother country from the united invasions of France and Spain. 'Tis a fertile island, and the different heights and situations among its mountains afford such different temperaments of air that all the fruits of northern and southern countries are produced there: corn, grapes, apples, peaches, oranges, lemons, plantains, bananas, etc. Here we furnished ourselves with fresh provisions and refreshments of all kinds, and after a few days proceeded on our voyage, running southward till we got into the trade winds, and then with them westward till we drew near the coast of America. The weather was so favorable that there were few days in which we could not visit from ship to ship, dining with each other and on board the man of war, which made the time pass agreeably, much more so than when one goes in a single ship. For this was like traveling in a moving village, with all one's neighbors about one. The reason of our being so long at sea was that, sailing with a convoy, we could none of us go faster than the slowest, being obliged every day to shorten sail or lay by till they came up. This was the only inconvenience of our having company, which was abundantly made up to us by the sense of greater security, the mutual good offices daily exchanged, and the other pleasures of society. On the first day of November, I arrived safe and well at my own house after an absence of near 6 years, and found my wife and daughter perfectly well, the latter grown quite a woman, with many amiable accomplishments acquired in my absence. I had the pleasure to find all faults that Dr. William Smith had reported about the diminution of my friends, who were as hearty and affectionate as ever. My house was filled with a succession of them from morning to night ever since I landed to congratulate me on my return, and I never experienced greater cordiality among them. I found the city of Philadelphia greatly increased in building, and they said it was so in numbers of inhabitants. But to me, the streets seemed thinner of people, owing perhaps to my being so long accustomed to the bustling, crowded streets of London. The expense of living was greatly advanced in my absence. It was more than double in most articles, and in some 'twas treble. This was by some ascribed to the scarcity of laborers, and thence the dearness of labor. But I think the dearness of labor, as well as of other things such as rent of old houses and value of lands, which are trebled in the last 6 years, are in great measure owing to the enormous plenty of money among us. There is such an over-proportion of money to the demand for a medium of trade in these countries that it seems from plenty to have lost much of its value. I also found notorious the number of taverns, alehouses, and dram shops that increased beyond all measure or necessity in Pennsylvania. They were placed so near to each other that they ruined one another, and 2/3 of them were not merely useless, but had become a pest to society. Very few of them were able to provide the necessary conveniences for entertaining travelers or accommodating the people either in country or city, and this was entirely owing to that weak policy in a former assembly of making it the interest of a governor to encourage and promote immorality and vice among the people. Many bills had been presented to the late governors to lessen the number and to regulate those nurseries of idleness and debauchery, but without success. While I was on the sea, my fellow citizens had, at the annual election, chosen me unanimously, as they had done every year while I was in England, to be their representative in assembly, and would, they said, if I had not disappointed them by coming privately to town before they heard of my landing, have met me with 500 horses. I had been chosen yearly during my absence to represent the city of Philadelphia in our provincial assembly, and on my appearance in the House they voted me £3,000 sterling for my services in England, and their thanks delivered by the Speaker. It had been industriously reported that I had lived very extravagantly in England and wasted a considerable sum of the public money which I had received out of the treasury for the province. But the Assembly, when they came to examine my accounts and allow me for my services, found themselves £2,214 10 shillings 7 pence sterling to my debt. In February following, my son arrived with my new daughter, for, with my consent and approbation, he married, soon after I left England, a very agreeable West Indian lady with whom he is very happy. I accompanied him to his government in New Jersey, where he met with the kindest reception from the people of all ranks. In the spring of 1763, I set out on a tour through all the northern colonies to inspect and regulate the post offices in the several provinces, we being under the necessity of making frequent and long journeys in person to see things with our own eyes, regulate what was amiss, and direct the necessary improvements. One of our goals was to expedite the communication between Boston and New York, as we had already that between New York and Philadelphia, by making the mails travel by night as well as day. It passes now between Philadelphia and New York so quick that a letter can be sent from one place to another and an answer received the day following, which before took a week. In this journey I spent the summer, traveled about 1,600 miles, and did not get home till the beginning of November. Having returned home, my daughter Sally endeavored to collect some of the music of this country production to send to Miss Janet Dick in Scotland in return for her most acceptable present of Scotch songs, music being a new art with us. Sally sang the songs to her harpsichord, and I played some of the softest tunes on my harmonica, with which entertainment our people were quite charmed and conceived the Scottish tunes to be the finest in the world. And indeed, there is so much simple beauty in many of them that it is my opinion they will never die, but in all ages find a number of admirers among those whose taste is not debauched by art. I give it my opinion that the reason why the Scotch tunes have lived so long, and will probably live forever if they escape being stifled in modern affected ornament, is merely this: that they are really compositions of melody and harmony united, or rather, that their melody is harmony. By this I mean the simple tunes sung by a single voice. As this will appear paradoxical, I must explain my meaning. In common acceptation, only an agreeable succession of sounds is called melody, and only the coexistence of agreeing sounds, harmony. But since the memory is capable of retaining for some moments a perfect idea of the pitch of a past sound, so as to compare it with the pitch of a succeeding sound, and judge truly of their agreement or disagreement, There may and does arise from thence a sense of harmony between present and past sounds, equally pleasing with that between two present sounds. Now the construction of the old Scotch tunes is that almost every succeeding emphatic note is a third, a fifth, an octave, or in short, some note that is in concord with the preceding note. Thirds are chiefly used, which are very pleasing concords. While home, I also visited the Negro School in Philadelphia in company with the Reverend Mr. Sturgeon and had the children thoroughly examined. They appeared all to have made considerably progress in reading for the time they had respectively been in the school, and most of them answered readily and well the questions of the catechism. They behaved very orderly, showed a proper respect and ready obedience to the mistress, and seemed very attentive to, and a good deal affected by, a serious exhortation with which Mr. Sturgeon concluded our visit. I was on the whole much pleased, and from what I then saw, have conceived a higher opinion of the natural capacities of the black race than I had ever before entertained. Their apprehension seems as quick, their memory as strong, and their docility in every respect equal to that of white children. Just before I left London, a gentleman requested I would sit for a picture to be drawn of me for him by a painter of his choosing. I did so, and the portrait was reckoned a very fine one. Since I came to Philadelphia, the painter had a print done for it, of which he sent a parcel to America for sale. I took a dozen of them and sent them to friends in Boston, which I believed would be the only way which I would likely visit them. The Assembly sitting through the following winter, and warm disputes arising between them and the governor, I became wholly engaged in public affairs. Our old speaker, Mr. Isaac Norris, had been long declining in his health. During the winter session he was unable to come to the State House, and the House met at his lodging. After some days he wrote to the House that he could no longer meet with them, and requested they choose another speaker, upon which they were pleased unanimously to choose your humble servant. Besides my duty as an assemblyman, I had another trust to execute, that of being one of the commissioners appointed by law to dispose of the public money appropriate to the raising and paying an army to act against the Indians and defend the frontiers. It was well known that I had no love of the governor, and he did not love me. Our totally different tempers forbid it, and yet I considered government as government, paid him all respect, gave him on all occasions my best advice, and promoted in the Assembly a ready compliance with everything he proposed or recommended. Then, in December 1763, we had 2 insurrections of the back inhabitants of our province, by whom 20 poor Indians were murdered, who had from the first settlement of the province lived among us and under the protection of our government. On Wednesday, the 14th of December, 1763, 57 men from some of our frontier townships came, all well mounted and armed with firelocks, hangers, and hatchets, having traveled through the country in the night to Conestoga Manor. There they surrounded the small village of Indian huts, and just at break of day broke into them all at once. Only 3 men, 2 women, and a boy were found at home. These poor defenseless creatures were immediately fired upon, stabbed, and hatcheted to death. All of them were scalped and otherwise horribly mangled. Then their huts were set on fire, and most of them burnt down. When the shocking news arrived in town, a proclamation was issued by the governor forbidding all persons to molest or injure the Indians. Notwithstanding this proclamation, those cruel men again assembled themselves, and hearing that the remaining 14 Indians were in the workhouse at Lancaster, went directly to the workhouse and by violence broke open the door and entered with the utmost fury in their countenances. When the poor wretches saw they had no protection nigh, nor could possibly escape, and being without the least weapon for defense, they divided into their little families, the children clinging to the parents. They fell on their knees, protesting their innocence, declaring their love to the English, and that, in their whole lives, they had never done them injury. And in this posture, they all received the hatchet. Men, women, and little children were every one inhumanly murdered in cold blood. As the rioters threatened further mischief, and their actions seemed to be approved by an increasing party, I wrote a pamphlet entitled A Narrative of the Late Massacres to strengthen the hands of our weak government by rendering the proceedings of the rioters unpopular and odious. This had a good effect, and afterwards, when a great body of them with arms marched towards the capital in defiance of the government with an avowed resolution to put to death 140 Indian converts then under its protection, I formed an association at the governor's request for his and their defense, we having no militia. Near 1,000 of the citizens accordingly took arms. The governor offered me the command of them, but I chose to carry a musket and strengthened his authority by setting an example of obedience to his orders. Governor Penn made my house for some time his headquarters and did everything by my advice, so that for about 48 hours I was a very great man, as I had been once some years before in a time of public danger. I was a common soldier, a counselor, a kind of dictator, an ambassador to the country mob, and on their returning home, nobody again. All this happened in a few weeks. But the fighting face we put on, and the reasonings we used with the insurgents, for I went at the request of the governor and council with 3 others to meet and discourse them, having turned them back and restored quiet to the city, I became a less man than ever, for I had by these transactions made myself many enemies among the populace, and the governor, with whose family our public disputes had long placed me in an unfriendly light, and the services I had lately rendered him not being the kind that make a man acceptable, thinking it a favorable opportunity, joined the whole weight of the proprietary interest to vote me out of the assembly, which was accordingly effected at the last election by a majority of about 25 in 4,000 voters. The House, however, when they met in October, approved of my resolutions when I was Speaker to petition the Crown for a change of government, having given up all hope of the proprietary government serving the people. The Assembly's petition was as follows. To the King's Most Excellent Majesty in Council. The petition of the representatives of the freemen of the province of Pennsylvania in General Assembly met, most humbly showeth that the government of this province by proprietaries has by long experience been found inconvenient, attended with many difficulties and obstructions to your Majesty's service, arising from the intervention of the proprietary private interests in public affairs and disputes concerning those interests. That the said proprietary government is weak, unable to support its own authority and maintain the common internal peace of the province, great riots having lately arisen therein, armed mobs marching from place to place and committing violent outrages and insults on the government with impunity, to the great terror of your Majesty's subjects. And these evils are not likely to receive any remedy here, the continual disputes between the proprietaries and people, and the mutual jealousies and dislikes preventing. We do therefore most humbly pray that your Majesty would be graciously pleased to resume the government of this province, making such compensation to the proprietaries for the same as to your Majesty's wisdom and goodness shall appear just and equitable, and permitting your dutiful subjects therein to enjoy under your Majesty's more immediate care and protection the privileges that have been granted to them by and under your royal predecessors. Signed by order of the House. For my own part, I thought it impossible to go longer with the proprietary government. Thus the Assembly requested me to return to England to prosecute that petition. which service I accordingly undertook and embarked the beginning of November 1764, being accompanied to the ship 16 miles by a cavalcade of 300 of my friends who filled our sails with good wishes. When in America, I promised myself the pleasure of a regular correspondence with many of the ingenious gentlemen that composed the Club of Honest Whigs. But after so long an absence from my family and affairs, I found so much occupation that philosophical matters could not be attended to, and my last summer was almost wholly taken up in long journeys. I wrote letters to Mr. Strahan and others, expressing my interest to conveniently remove to England, but I was never able to persuade the good woman to cross the seas, she always having an invincible aversion to it, even with the help of friends. Chapter 3. Second Mission to England, 1764 to 1775. On sea, we had terrible weather, and I often was thankful that my dear daughter Sally was not with me. Arriving in Portsmouth after 30 days, I traveled 72 miles to London in a short winter day, and think I must have practiced flying. But the roads in England were so good, with post-chaises and fresh horses every 10 or 12 miles, that it was no difficult matter. A lady that I know came from Edinburgh to London, being 400 miles, in 3 days and half. I once more had the pleasure of living at Craven Street. Mrs. Stevenson was not home, and the maid could not tell where to find her, so I sat me down and waited her return, and when she arrived, she was a good deal surprised to find me in her parlor. I had the pleasure of finding my old friend Strahan and all his family well and happy. Those of my old friends who were in town gave me a most cordial welcome, but many were yet in the country, the Parliament not meeting till the 10th of January. Immediately upon my arrival, for 10 or 12 days, I was severely handled by a most violent cold that worried me extremely. By February, I was almost well, with the cough quite gone, and my arms continued mending so that I could put on and off my clothes, though it still hurt a little. I also had a visitation from that friend, or enemy, the gout, that confined me near a fortnight. By June, I was in perfect health and wrote my dear Debbie on the great share of health we had both enjoyed, though going in the 4th score. I wrote, "God has been very good to us in many respects. Therefore, let us enjoy his favors with a thankful and cheerful heart, and as we can make no direct return to him, show our sense of his goodness to us by continuing to do good to our fellow creatures without regarding the returns they make us, whether good or bad. For they are all his children, though they may sometimes be our enemies. The friendships of this world are changeable, uncertain, transitory things, but his favor, if we can secure it, is an inheritance forever." In my younger days, having once some leisure, which I still think I might have employed more usefully, I had amused myself in making magic squares, and at length had acquired such a knack of it that I could fill the cells of any magic square of reasonable size with a series of numbers as fast as I could write them, disposed in such a manner as that the sums of every row, horizontal, perpendicular, or diagonal, should be equal. But not being satisfied with these, which I looked on as common and easy things, I had imposed on myself much more difficult tasks, and succeeded in making other magic squares with a variety of properties and much more curious. I did not, however, end with squares, but composed also a magic circle consisting of 8 concentric circles and 8 radial rows, filled with a series of numbers from 12 to 75 inclusive, so disposed as that the numbers of each circle or each radial row being added to the central number 12, they made exactly 360, the number of degrees in a circle. And this circle had, moreover, all the properties of the square of 8. At Craven Street, in correspondence with friends in Pennsylvania, I revised the magic circles I had made many years before, and with some improvements. I made it as distinct as I could by using inks of different colors for the several sets of interwoven circles, and yet the whole made so complex an appearance that I doubted whether the eyes could in all cases easily trace the circle of numbers one might examine through the maze of circles intersected by it. I therefore, in the middle circle, marked the centers of the green, red, yellow, and blue sets so that when the numbers in any circle of any of those colors were cast up, if one fixed one foot of the compass in the center of the same color and extended the other foot to any number in that circle, it would pass round over all the rest successively. This magic circle had more properties than are mentioned in the description of it, some of them curious and even surprising, but I could not mark them all without occasioning more confusion in the figure, nor easily describe them without too much writing. As to business, I was immediately engaged in public affairs related to America and in the petition to change the government in Pennsylvania. But the unsettled state of the ministry ever since the Parliament passed the Stamp Act had stopped all proceedings in public affairs and ours among the rest. Every step in the law, every newspaper, advertisement, and almanac was to be severely taxed, falling particularly hard on us lawyers and printers. At first I was not much alarmed about Parliament's schemes of raising money on the colonies, thinking that the government would take care for their own sakes not to lay greater burdens on us than we could bear. For they could not hurt us without hurting themselves. All our profits centered with England, and the more they took from us, the less we could lay out to them. As to the true history of the Stamp Act, the facts are these. Sometime in the winter of 1763 to 1764, Mr. Grenville had called together the agents of the several colonies and told them that he purposed to draw a revenue from America, and to that end his intention was to levy a stamp duty on the colonies by Act of Parliament in the ensuing session, and if any other duty equally productive would be more agreeable to them, they might let him know it. I was a member of the Assembly of Pennsylvania when this notification came to hand. In a resolution, we observed that the ancient, established, and regular method of drawing aids from the colonies was that the sovereign would direct his Secretary of State to write circular letters to the several governors, who would lay them before their assemblies, that upon their satisfaction, the assemblies would grant such sums as should be suitable to their abilities, loyalty, and zeal for his service, that the colonies had always granted liberally on such requisitions, and so liberally during the previous war that the king, sensible they had granted much more than their proposition, had recommended it to Parliament 5 years successively to make them some compensation, and the Parliament accordingly returned them £200,000 a year to be divided among them, and that the proposition of taxing them in Parliament was therefore both cruel and unjust. I went soon after to England and took with me an authentic copy of this resolution, which I presented to Mr. Grenville before he brought in the Stamp Act. I asserted in the House of Commons, Mr. Grenville being present, that I had done so, and he did not deny it. Other colonies made similar resolutions, and had Mr. Grenville instead of that act applied to the King and Council for such requisitional letters to be circulated by the Secretary of State, I am sure he would have obtained more money from the colonies by their voluntary grants than he himself expected from his stamps. But he chose compulsion rather than persuasion, and would not receive from their goodwill what he thought he could obtain without it. And thus the golden bridge which the ingenious author thinks the Americans unwisely and unbecomingly refused to hold out to the minister and Parliament was actually held out to them, but they refused to walk over it. I took every step in my power to prevent the passing of the Stamp Act. Nobody could have been more concerned in interest than myself to oppose it sincerely and heartedly. But the tide was too strong against us. The nation was provoked by American claims of independence, and all parties joined in resolving by this act to settle the point. We might as well have hindered the sun's setting. That we could not do. But since 'tis down, we could still light candles. As I wrote in Father Abraham's speech, frugality and industry will go a great way towards indemnifying us. Idleness and pride tax us with a heavier hand than kings and parliaments. If we can get rid of the former, we may easily bear the latter. For we are taxed twice as much by our idleness, 3 times as much by our pride, and 4 times as much by our folly. Mr. Hall wrote me about the ferment in the colonies over the Stamp Act. That Mr. Oliver, the stamp officer, was hanged in effigy in Boston. That a house was pulled down which was supposed to have been erected for the business of the stamp office. That the spirit of the people was violently against everyone they thought had the least concern with the stamp law, and that many had imbibed the false notion that I had a hand in the framing of the Stamp Act, which occasioned me many enemies. He reported that all the papers on the American continent, except our Pennsylvania Gazette, were full of spirited papers against the stamp law, and that because he did not publish those papers likewise, he was much blamed, got a great deal of ill will, and that some of our customers had stopped subscribing on that account. I told him that he had acted very prudently in omitting the pieces that were printed in other papers, and I would have been equally averse to printing them even if I had held no office under the Crown. A Mr. Thompson tendered me a response, of which I gave an extract to a friend who printed it in the London Chronicle. I reprinted everything from America that I thought might help our common cause. It said in part, "The sun of liberty is indeed fast setting, if not down already in the American colonies. But I much fear instead of the American candles you mentioned being lighted, you will hear the works of darkness." In November 1765, I received letters from my wife, my daughter Sally, and our good neighbors relating to raising a mob at my home in Philadelphia in protest of the Stamp Act. I honored much the spirit and courage my wife showed, and the prudent preparations she made in that time of danger. I wrote her, "The woman deserves a good house who is determined to defend it." The disturbances in the colonies gave me great concern, as I feared the event would be pernicious to America in general. The rashness of the Assembly in Virginia was amazing. I had hoped that ours would keep within the bounds of prudence and moderation, for that, I believed, was the only way to lighten or get clear of our burdens and facilitate my endeavor to get the Stamp Act repealed. I assured my wife and friends that nothing could be falser than the reports that I had even the least hand in framing the Stamp Act or procuring any other burden on our country. In truth, I never in my life labored any point more heartedly than I did that of obtaining the repeal. I shall long remember a pious Presbyterian countryman who set the people a-madding by telling them that I planned the Stamp Act. I thanked him that he did not charge me, as they do their God, with having planned Adam's fall and the damnation of mankind. I had a long audience at this time with Lord Dartmouth. He had been highly recommended to me by Lords Grantham and Bessborough as a young man of excellent understanding and the most amiable disposition. I found him to be all they said of him. I gave him my opinion that the general execution of the Stamp Act was impracticable without occasioning more mischief than it was worth by totally alienating the affections of the Americans from Britain and thereby lessening its commerce. I strongly recommended either a thorough union with America or that government in Britain would proceed in the old method of requisition, by which, I was confident, more would be obtained in the way of voluntary grant than could probably be got by compulsory taxes laid by Parliament. Particular colonies might at times be backward, but at other times, when in better temper, they would make up for that backwardness, so that on the whole it would be nearly equal. To send armies and fleets to enforce the act would not, in my opinion, answer any good end except the danger, by mutual violences, excesses, and severities, of creating a deep-rooted aversion between the two countries and laying the foundation of a future total separation. A great deal more I said on our American affairs. His lordship heard all with great attention and patience. He thanked me politely for the visit and desired to see me often. During the course of the debate on the Stamp Act, I appeared on February 13, 1766, before the committee of the whole of the House of Commons and spoke my mind pretty plainly. I enclose the imperfect account that was taken of that examination. Question: What is your name and place of abode? Franklin of Philadelphia. Do the Americans pay any considerable taxes among themselves? Certainly many, and very heavy taxes. Are not the colonies, from their circumstances, very able to pay the stamp duty? In my opinion, there is not gold or silver enough in the colonies to pay the stamp duty for 1 year. Are you not concerned in the management of the post office in America? Yes, I am Deputy Postmaster General of North America. Don't you think the distribution of stamps by post to all the inhabitants very practicable if there was no opposition? The posts only go along the seacoasts. They do not, except in a few instances, go back into the country, and if they did, sending for stamps by post would occasion an expense of postage amounting, in many cases, to much more than that of the stamps themselves. Do you think it right that America should be protected by this country and pay no part of the expenses? America has been greatly misrepresented and abused here in papers and pamphlets and speeches as ungrateful and unreasonable and unjust, and in having put this nation to immense expense for their defense and refusing to bear any part of that expense. But that is not the case. The colonies raised, clothed, and paid during the last war near 25,000 men and spent many millions. Were you not reimbursed by Parliament? We were only reimbursed what, in your opinion, we had advanced beyond our proportion, or beyond what might have been reasonably expected from us, and it was a very small part of what we spent. Pennsylvania in particular disbursed about £500,000, and the reimbursement in the whole did not exceed £60,000. This is the strongest of all proofs that the colonies, far from being unwilling to bear a share of the burden, did exceed their proportion. Do you not think the people of America would submit to pay the stamp duty if it was moderated? No, never, unless compelled by force of arms. What was the temper of America toward Great Britain before the year 1763? The best in the world. They submitted willingly to the government of the Crown and paid, in all their courts, obedience to acts of Parliament. Numerous as the people are in the several provinces, they cost you nothing in forts, citadels, garrisons, or armies to keep them in subjection. They were governed by this country at the expense only of a little pen, ink, and paper. They were led by a thread. They had not only a respect but an affection for Great Britain, for its laws, its customs and manners, and even a fondness for its fashions that greatly increased the commerce. Natives of Britain were always treated with particular regard. To be an Old England man was of itself a character of some respect, and gave a kind of rank among them. And what is their temper now? Oh, very much altered. In what light did the people of America used to consider the Parliament of Great Britain? They considered the Parliament as the great bulwark and security of their liberties and veneration. Arbitrary ministers, they thought, might possibly at times attempt to oppress them, but they relied on it that Parliament, on application, would always give redress. And have they not still the same respect for Parliament? No, it is greatly lessened. To what causes is that owing? To a concurrence of causes. The restraints lately laid on their trade, by which the bringing of foreign gold and silver into the colonies was prevented, the prohibition of making paper money among themselves and then demanding a new and heavy tax by stamps, taking away at the same time trials by jury and refusing to receive and hear their humble petitions. Have you not heard of the resolutions of this House and of the House of Lords, asserting the right of Parliament, relating to America, including a power to tax the people there? Yes, I have heard of such resolutions. What will be the opinion of the Americans on those resolutions? They will think them unconstitutional and unjust. Was it an opinion in America before 1763 that the Parliament had no right to lay taxes and duties there? I never heard any objection to the rights of laying duties to regulate commerce, but a right to lay internal taxes was never supposed to be in Parliament, as we are not represented there. If the act is not repealed, what do you think will be the consequences? The total loss of the respect and affection the people of America bear to this country, and of all the commerce that depends on that respect and affection. But if the legislature should think fit to ascertain its right to lay taxes by an act laying a small tax contrary to their opinion, would they submit to pay the tax? The proceedings of the assemblies have been very different from those of the mobs and should be distinguished as having no connection with each other. The assemblies have only peaceably resolved what they take to be their rights. They have taken no measures for opposition by force. They have not built a fort, raised a man, or provided a grain of ammunition in order to enforce such opposition. The ringleaders of riots they think ought to be punished, but as to an internal tax, how small soever, laid by the legislature here on the people there, while they have no representatives in this legislature, I think it will never be submitted to. They will oppose it to the last. They do not consider it at all necessary for you to raise money on them by your taxes, because they are, and always have been, ready to raise money by taxes among themselves, and to grant large sums equal to their abilities upon requisition from the Crown. What used to be the pride of the Americans? To indulge in the fashions and manufactures of Great Britain. What is now their pride? To wear their own clothes over again till they can make new ones. 2 weeks after my examination before the government, I was made very happy by a vote of the Commons on February 22, 1766, for the repeal of the mother of mischiefs, the Stamp Act. The House of Commons, after a long debate, came to a resolution 275 to 167. Great honor and thanks was due to the British merchants trading to America, all of them being our zealous and indefatigable friends. In honor of its repeal, I sent my wife a new gown, informing her that had the trade between the new countries totally ceased, it was a comfort to me to recollect that I had once been clothed from head to foot in woolen and linen of my wife's manufacture, that I never was prouder of any dress in my life, and that she and my daughter might do it again if it was necessary. I learned from letters from home that upon the news in America, bells rang, bonfires were set, fireworks illuminated, and cannon fired. As to the reports that spread to my disadvantage during the Stamp Act affair, I gave myself as little concern about them as possible. I have often met with such treatment from people that I was all the while endeavoring to serve. At other times, I have been extolled extravagantly when I have had little or no merit. These are the operations of nature. It sometimes is cloudy, it rains, it hails. Again, 'tis clear and pleasant, and the sun shines on us. Take one thing with another, and the world is a pretty good sort of world, and 'tis our duty to make the best of it and be thankful. One's true happiness depends more on one's own judgment of one's self, on a consciousness of rectitude in action and intention, and on the approbation of those few who judge impartially, than upon the applause of the unthinking, undiscerning multitude who are apt to cry, Hosanna today, and tomorrow, crucify him. I thank God that I have enjoyed a greater share of health, strength, and activity than is common with people of my years. As to the abuses I have met with, I number them among my honors. One cannot behave so as to obtain the esteem of the wise and good without drawing on oneself at the same time the envy and malice of the foolish and wicked, and the latter is testimony of the former. The best men have always had their share of this treatment, and the more of it in proportion to their different and greater degrees of merit. A man has therefore some reason to be ashamed of himself when he meets with none of it. And the world is not to be condemned in the lump because some bad people live in it. Their number is not great. The hurt they do is but small, as real good characters always finally surmount and are established, notwithstanding attempts to keep them down. And in the meantime, such enemies do a man good, while they think they are doing him harm, by fortifying the character they would destroy. For when he sees how readily imaginary faults and crimes are laid to his charge, he must be more apprehensive of the danger of committing real ones. I call to mind what my friend good Mr. Whitefield said to me once on such an occasion. I read the libels writ against you when I was in a remote province where I could not be informed of the truth of the facts, but they rather gave me this good opinion of you, that you continued to be useful to the public. For when I am on the road and see boys in a field at a distance pelting a tree, though I am too far off to know what tree it is, I conclude it has fruit on it. My enemies were forced to content themselves with abusing me plentifully in the newspapers. 'Tis the fashion in the newspapers to abuse and roast one another, and I sometimes took a little of that diversion myself. In their endeavor to provoke me to resign from the post office, they were not likely to succeed, I being deficient in that Christian virtue of resignation. If they would have my office, they must take it. I have heard of some great man whose rule it was with regard to offices, never to ask for them and never to refuse them, to which I have always added in my own practice, never to resign them. During the course of the Stamp Act affair, I was extremely busy attending members of both houses, informing, explaining, consulting, disputing, in a continual hurry from morning to night till the affair was happily ended. Following the affair, I became ill again. I had been used to making a journey once a year, the want of which the previous year had, I believed, hurt me, so that, though I was not quite to say sick, I was often ailing that winter and through this spring. Once nearly well, but feeble, by summer I set out with my friend Sir John Pringle, the Queen's physician, on a journey to Plymouth, Germany, where we drank the waters some days. I traveled a good deal for my health in Germany that summer, which I found a very fine country, and seemingly not so much hurt by the late war as one might have expected, since it appeared everywhere fully cultivated, notwithstanding the great loss it sustained in people. As I was soon well, my hearty journey had perfectly answered its intention. In December 1766, I was asked to recommend 2 young sons of my friends in Philadelphia to the study of physic, medicine, in Edinburgh. Herein is a letter I sent to them. To Benjamin Rush and Jonathan Potts, London, December 20th, 1766. Gentlemen, with this letter I send you letters for several of my friends at Edinburgh. It will be a pleasure to me if they prove of use to you. But you will be your own best friends if you apply diligently to your studies, refraining from all idle, useless amusements that are apt to lessen or withdraw the attention from your main business. This, from the characters you bear in the letters you brought me, I am persuaded you will do. Letters of recommendation may serve a stranger for a day or two, but where he is to reside for years, he must depend on his own conduct, which will either increase or totally destroy the effect of such letters. I take the freedom, therefore, of counseling you to be very circumspect and regular in your behavior at Edinburgh, where the people are very shrewd and observing, that doing so you may bring from thence as good a character as you carry thither, and in that respect not be inferior to any American in going to study at Edinburgh at this time, where there happens to be collected a set of as truly great professors of the several branches of knowledge as have ever appeared in any age or country. I recommend one thing particularly to you, that besides the study of medicine, you endeavor to obtain a thorough knowledge of natural philosophy in general. You will from thence draw great aids in judging well both of diseases and remedies, and avoid many errors. I mention this because I have observed that a number of physicians here, as well as in America, are miserably deficient in it. I wish you all happiness and success in your undertakings, and remain your friend and humble servant, B. Franklin. In 1748, at the age of 42, I took the proper measures for obtaining leisure to enjoy life and my friends more than heretofore, and put my printing house under the care of my partner, Mr. David Hall, absolutely leaving off bookselling, etc. In 1767, my long partnership of the printing business with Mr. Hall expired, wherein a great source of my income was cut off. My family's subsistence was thereby reduced to our rent and interest of money, which meant by no means could I afford the chargeable housekeeping and entertaining I had been used to. For my own part, I lived in London as frugally as possible, not to be destitute of the comforts of life, making no dinners for anybody, and contenting myself with a single dish when I dined at home. And yet such was the dearness of living in every article that my expenses amazed me. I saw, too, that in my absence my wife's expenses were very great. Her situation was very much sensible that naturally occasioned a great many visitors, which expense was not easily avoided, especially when one has been long in the practice and habit of it. But when people's incomes are lessened, if they cannot proportionately lessen their outgoings, they must come to poverty. If we were young enough to begin business again, it might have been another matter, but I doubt not we were past it. And business not well managed ruins one faster than no business. In short, with frugality and prudent care, we may subsist decently on what we have and leave it entire to our children. But without such care, we shall not be able to keep it together. It will melt away like butter in the sunshine, and we may live long enough to feel the miserable consequences of our indiscretion. Therefore, I had to limit payments to my wife to the sum of £30 per month, making £360 a year, and receiving the rents of 7 or 8 houses besides, which might be sufficient for the maintenance of my family in Philadelphia. I judged such a limitation the more necessary, as my wife was not very attentive to money matters in her best days, and I did not like her going about among my friends to borrow money. At the same time, Deborah informed me that our daughter, Sally, had become engaged to a gentleman, Richard Bache. I at first could say nothing agreeable about the marriage, writing him that I loved my daughter perhaps as well as ever a parent did a child, but being that my estate was small, scarce a sufficiency for the support of me and my wife, who were growing old and could not bustle for a living as we had done, that little could therefore be spared out of it while we lived. Moreover, I thought the step Mr. Bache had taken to engage himself in the charge of a family, while his affairs bore so unpromising an aspect with regard to the probable means of maintaining it, was a very rash and precipitate one. I could not, therefore, but be dissatisfied with it, and displeased with him whom I looked upon as an instrument of bringing future unhappiness on my child, by involving her in the difficulty and distress that seemed connected with his circumstances, his having not merely nothing beforehand, but being besides greatly in debt. Nevertheless, time and his better prospects in business made me easier, and I gave them my best wishes, that if he proved a good husband to her and a good son to me, he would find me as an affectionate father. Soon they gave birth to a son, Benjamin Franklin Bache. All who saw my grandson Benny agreed of his being an uncommonly fine boy, which brought often afresh to my mind the idea of my son Frankie, though dead many years ago, whom I have seldom since seen equaled in everything, and whom to this day I cannot think of without a sigh. In December 1771, I found Mr. Bache at his mother and sister's house in Preston, England. I very much liked his behavior. We spent 2 days in Preston, and I brought him to London with me, where I introduced him to Mrs. Stevenson and her daughter Polly. Mr. Bache had some views of obtaining an office in America, but I dissuaded him from the application and advised him to settle down to business in Philadelphia, where he would always be with Sally. That it would have been wrong for Sally to leave her mother. Industry and frugality would pay his debts and get him forward in the world. I am of the opinion that almost any profession a man has been educated in is preferable to an office held at pleasure, as rendering him more independent, more a freeman, and less subject to the caprices of superiors. I advised Sally to learn accounts and keep a store, and thereby be serviceable to him as my wife was to me. Till my return, I offered them no expense for rent, so that they might attend my dear wife as she grew infirmed, and she could take delight in their company and the child's. I gave him £200 as good luck. I was happy to learn from my sister Jane Meekham that a good understanding continued between her and my folks upon her visit to Philadelphia. My father, a very wise man, used to say nothing was more common than for those who loved one another at a distance to find many causes of dislike when they came together, and therefore he did not approve of visits to relations in distant places which could not well be short enough for them to part good friends. I saw a proof of it in the disgusts between him and his brother Benjamin, and though I was a child, I still remember how affectionate their correspondence was while they were separated, and the disputes and misunderstandings they had when they came to live some time together in the same house. I often wished that I were employed by the Crown to settle a colony in Ohio, that we could do it effectually and without putting the nation to much expense. What a glorious thing it would have been to settle in that fine country a large, strong body of religious and industrious people. What a security to the other colonies and advantage to Britain by increasing her people, territory, strength, and commerce. Might it not have greatly facilitated the introduction of pure religion among the heathen if we could, by such a colony, show them a better sample of Christians than they commonly saw in our Indian traders, the most vicious and abandoned wretches of our nation? In such an enterprise I could have spent the remainder of my life with pleasure. In 1769, I joined with Thomas Walpole, Richard Jackson, and others in the Grand Ohio Company to apply for a grant of 2,400,000 acres of land in the territory on the Ohio purchased of the Indians, which land was to be settled by people from the neighboring provinces, and that would be of great advantage in a few years to the undertakers of the project, an opportunity of making a considerable addition to our fortunes, as the expense was a trifle. Each share was equal to 40,000 acres. The application was raised to 20 million acres in January 1770. We were daily amused with expectations that it would be completed at this and t'other time, but I saw no progress made in it. And I think more and more that I was right in never placing any great dependence on it. The Ohio affair always seemed near a conclusion, but so difficult was it to get business forwarded in London, in which some party purpose was not to be served, that as to our prospect of success, many things slip between cup and lip. The affair of the grant dragged on but slowly, and I began to be a little of the sailor's mind when they were handing a cable out of a store into a ship, and one of them said, "'Tis a long, heavy cable. I wish we could see the end of it." "Damn me," says another, "if I believe it has any end. Somebody has cut it off." Years later, in 1774, I was told that some persons in administration had suggested that my conduct in affairs between England and North America had entitled me to a mark of favor in the granting of lands on the Ohio. I never considered the purchase of these lands as a favor from the government, nor a great bargain to the purchasers. The agreement for them was fair and public, at a price fully adequate to their value. I nevertheless wrote a letter to Thomas Walpole desiring that my name be struck out of the list of associates, and wished them all success in their hazardous undertaking. In 1767, some incidents revived the contest between the two countries, creating a great disorder in public affairs. In the same session with the Stamp Act, an act had been passed to regulate the quartering of soldiers in America, with a clause directing that empty houses, barns, etc. should be hired for them, and that the respective provinces where they were should pay the expense and furnish the firing, bedding, drink, and some other articles to the soldiers gratis. But the New York Assembly refused to do it, which caused great mischief and alienation of the affection of the people of America toward the British Empire. It was a common but mistaken notion in Britain that the colonies were planted at the expense of Parliament, and that therefore the Parliament had a right to tax them, etc. The truth is, they were planted at the expense of private adventurers who went over to America to settle with leave of the king given by charter. On receiving this leave and these charters, the adventurers voluntarily engaged to remain the king's subjects, though in a foreign country, a country which had not been conquered by either king or parliament, but was possessed by a free people. When our planters arrived, they purchased the lands of the natives without putting king or parliament to any expense. Parliament had no hand in their settlement, was never so much as consulted about their constitution, and took no kind of notice of them till many years after they were established. But nothing was more common at this time in England than to talk of the sovereignty of Parliament and the sovereignty of that nation over the colonies. Upon the whole, I had lived so much of my life in Britain and formed so many friendships in it that I said at the time that I loved it and wished its prosperity and its union secured and established. But as to America, the advantages of such a union to her were not so apparent. Scotland and Ireland were differently circumstanced. Confined by sea, they could scarcely increase in numbers, wealth, and strength so as to overbalance England. But America, an immense territory, favored by nature with all advantages of climate, soil, great navigable rivers and lakes, etc., was destined to become a great country, populous and mighty, and would in a less time than was generally conceived be able to shake off any shackles that might be imposed on her, and perhaps place them on the impostors. In the meantime, every act of oppression soured their tempers, lessened greatly, if not annihilated, the profits of British commerce with them, and hastened their final revolt. For the seeds of liberty are universally sown there, and nothing could eradicate them. I stayed too long in London and made a trip with Sir John Pringle into France in August. At Dover we embarked for Calais. Various impositions we suffered from boatmen, porters, etc. on both sides of the water. I knew not which were more rapacious, the English or the French. But the latter have with their knavery the most politeness. The roads we found equally good with the English, in some places paved for many miles together with smooth stone like the new streets in London, and rows of trees on each side, and yet there were no turnpikes. But then the poor peasants complained to us grievously that they were obliged to work upon the roads full 2 months in the year without being paid for their labor. Whether this is truth, or whether, like Englishmen, they grumble cause or no cause, I was not able fully to inform myself. There were fair women in Paris who, I thought, were not whitened by art. As to rouge, they didn't pretend to imitate nature in laying it on. This was the mode, from the actresses on the stage upward through all ranks of ladies to the princesses of the blood, but it stopped there, the queen not using it, having in the serenity, complacency, and benignity that shone so eminently in, or rather through, her countenance, sufficient beauty, though then an old woman, to do extremely well without it. I speak of the queen as if I had seen her, and so I had, at court. We went to Versailles on a Sunday and had the honor of being presented to the King, Louis XV, who spoke to both of us very graciously and cheerfully. He was a handsome man, had a very lively look, and appeared younger than he was. In the evening, we were at the Grand Couvert, where the royal family supped in public. An officer of the court brought us up through the crowd of spectators and placed Sir John so as to stand between the king and Madame Adelaide, and me between the Queen and Madame Victoire. The king talked a good deal to Sir John, asking many questions about the royal family, and did me, too, the honor of taking some notice of me. Versailles had infinite sums laid out in building it and supplying it with water. Some say the expense exceeded 80 million sterling. The range of building was immense. The garden front, most magnificent, all of hewn stone. A number of statues, figures, urns, etc., in marble and bronze of exquisite workmanship was beyond conception. But the waterworks were out of repair when we were there, and so was a great part of the front next to the town, looking with its shabby half-brick walls and broken windows not much better than the houses in Durham Yard. There was, in short, both at Versailles and Paris, a prestigious mixture of magnificence and negligence with every kind of eloquence except that of cleanliness and what we call tidiness. Though I must do Paris the justice to say that in 2 points of cleanliness they exceeded us. The water they drank, though from the river, they rendered as pure as that of the best spring by filtering it through cisterns filled with sand, and the streets, by constant sweeping, were fit to walk in, though there was no paved footpath. Accordingly, many well-dressed people were constantly seen walking in them. The crowds of coaches and chairs, for that reason, were not so great. Men as well as women carried umbrellas in their hands, which they extended in case of rain or too much sun. The civilities we everywhere received gave us the strongest impressions of the French politeness. It seemed to be a point settled universally that strangers were to be treated with respect, and one had just the same deference shown one in France by being a stranger as in England by being a lady. The custom-house officers at Port Saint-Denis, as we entered Paris, were about to seize 24 of excellent Bordeaux wine given us at Boulogne, and which we brought with us. But as soon as they found we were strangers, it was immediately remitted on that account. At the church of Notre Dame, when we went to see a magnificent illuminations with figures, etc., for the deceased Dauphiness, we found an immense crowd who were kept out by guards, but the officer being told that we were strangers from England, he immediately admitted us, accompanied and showed us everything. Every night, Sundays not excepted, were plays and operas, and though the weather was hot and the houses full, one is not incommoded by the heat so much as with us in winter. They must have had some way of changing the air that we are not acquainted with. Traveling is one way of lengthening life, at least in appearance. It had been but a fortnight since we left London, but the variety of scenes we had gone through made it seem equal to 6 months living in one place. Perhaps I had suffered a greater change, too, in my own person than I could have done in 6 years at home. I had not been there 6 days before my tailor and perruquier had transformed me into a Frenchman. Only think what a figure I made in a little bag wig and naked ears. They told me that I was become 20 years younger and looked very gallant. So, being in Paris, where the mode was to be sacredly followed, I was once very near making love to my friend's wife, Mrs. Dalabar, which made a lasting impression on my memory. In our return home, we were detained a week at Calais by contrary winds and stormy weather, which was the more mortifying to me when I reflected that I might have enjoyed Paris and my friends there all that time. I returned to London safe and well, having had an exceedingly pleasant journey and quite recovered my health. But the time I spent as a stranger in Paris, in the improving conversation and agreeable society of so many learned and ingenious men, seemed now to me like a pleasing dream from which I was sorry to be awakened by finding myself again at London. I often wished I could procure more attention to the British ministry. I had urged over and over the necessity of the change we desired, but as we entered the year 1768, England was in a situation very little better than ours, which weakened our argument that a royal government would be better managed and safer to live under than that of a proprietary. All respect to law and government seemed to be lost among the common people, who were, moreover, continually inflamed by seditious scribblers to trample on authority and everything that used to keep them in order. I wrote a piece under the name Medius in the Gentleman's Magazine for the month of April 1768, intended to lessen the effect of the numerous inflammatory papers on the minds of the laboring poor. I noted that for 2 years past, much invective had been met in the papers against the hard-heartedness of the rich, and much complaint of the great oppression suffered by the laboring poor, as if the rich in England had no compassion for the poor. I remarked that the condition of the poor in England was by far the best in Europe. Except in England and the American colonies, there is not in any country of the known world, not even in Scotland or Ireland, a provision by law to enforce a support for the poor. This law was not made by the poor. The legislatures were men of fortune. By that act, they voluntarily subjected their own estates and the estates of others to the payment of a tax for the maintenance of the poor. I wish they could be benefited by this generous provision in any degree equal to the good intention with which it was made. But I fear the giving mankind a dependence on anything for support in age or sickness, besides industry and frugality during youth and health, tends to flatter our national indolence, to encourage idleness and prodigality, and thereby to promote and increase poverty, the very evil it was intended to cure, thus multiplying beggars instead of diminishing them. Besides this tax, which the rich in England subjected themselves to in behalf of the poor, amounting in some places to 5 or 6 shillings in the pound of the annual income, they had, by donation and subscriptions, erected numerous schools in various parts of the kingdom for educating gratis the children of the poor in reading and writing, and in many of those schools the children were also fed and clothed. They erected hospitals at an immense expense for the reception and cure of the sick, the lame, the wounded, and the insane poor, for lying-in women and deserted children. They also continually contributed toward making up losses occasioned by fire, by storms, or by floods, and to relieve the poor in severe seasons of frost, in times of scarcity, etc. Surely there should be some gratitude due for so many instances of goodness. Much malignant censure did some writers bestow upon the rich for their luxury and expensive living, while the poor starve, etc. However, they do not consider what the rich expend and what the laboring poor receive in payment for their labor. The rich do not work for one another. Their habitations, furniture, clothing, carriages, food, ornaments, and everything, in short, that they or their families use and consume, is the work or produce of the laboring poor, who are and must be continually paid for their labor in producing the same. In these payments, the revenues of the private estates are expended, for most people live up to their incomes, so that finally, our laboring poor receive annually the whole of the clear revenues of the nation. If it be said that their wages are too low, I heartily wish any means could be fallen upon to raise them, consistent with their interest and happiness. How is this to be remedied? A law might be made to raise their wages, but if our manufactures are too dear, they will not vend abroad, and all that part of employment will fail unless by fighting and conquering we compel other nations to buy our goods. A law might be made to raise their wages, but I doubt much whether it could be executed to any purpose unless another law, now indeed almost obsolete, could at the same time be revived and enforced. A law, I mean, that many have often heard and repeated, but few have ever duly considered. 6 days shalt thou labor. This is as positive a part of the commandment as that which says, the 7th day thou shalt rest. But we remember well to observe the indulgent part, and never think of the other. Monday is generally as duly kept by our working people as Sunday. The only difference is that, instead of employing their time cheaply at church, they are wasting it expensively at the alehouse. My piece, along with one I wrote against smuggling in the Chronicle of November last, was shown to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who expressed themselves much pleased with them. The Parliament was sitting, but would not continue long together, nor undertake any material business. Nothing was talked or thought of in England but elections. There were amazing contests all over the kingdom. £20,000 or £30,000 of a side spent in several places, and inconceivable mischief done by debauching the people and making them idle, besides the immediate actual mischief done by drunken mad mobs to houses, windows, etc. The scenes were horrible. London was illuminated 2 nights running at the command of the mob for the success of John Wilkes in the Middlesex election. The second night exceeded anything of the kind ever seen on the greatest occasions of rejoicing, as even the small cross streets, lanes, courts, and other out-of-the-way places were all ablaze with lights, and the principal streets all night long, as the mobs went around again after 2 o'clock, and obliged people who had extinguished their candles to light them again. Those who refused had all their windows destroyed. The damage done and the expense of candles had been computed at £50,000. 'Twas really an extraordinary event to see this Wilkes, an outlaw and exile of bad personal character, not worth a farthing, come over from France, set himself up as candidate for the capital of the king, miss his election only by being too late in his application, and immediately carry it to the principal county. The mob, spirited up by numbers of different ballads sung or roared in every street, required gentlemen and ladies of all ranks as they passed in their carriages to shout for Wilkes and Liberty, marking the same words on all their coaches with chalk, and number 45 on every door, which extended a vast way along the roads into the country. In April I went to Winchester and observed that for 15 miles out of town there was scarce a door or window shutter next to the road unmarked, and this continued here and there quite to Winchester, which is 64 miles. I was sorry to see in the American papers that some people there were so indiscreet as to distinguish themselves in applauding his number 45, which I suppose they did not know was a paper in which their king was personally affronted, whom they surely loved and honored at the time. It hurts to see sober, sensible men so easily infected with the madness of English mobs. Even the capital, the residence of the king, became a daily scene of lawless riot and confusion. Mobs were patrolling the streets at noonday, some knocking all down who would not roar for Wilkes and liberty. Courts of justice were afraid to give judgment against him. Coal heavers and porters pulled down the houses of coal merchants who refused to give them more wages. Sawyers destroyed the new sawmills. Sailors unrigged all the outward-bound ships and suffered none to sail till merchants agreed to raise their pay. Watermen destroyed private boats and threatened bridges. Weavers entered houses by force and destroyed the work in the looms. Soldiers fired among the mobs and killed men, women, and children, which seemed only to have produced a universal sullenness that looked like a great black cloud coming on, ready to burst in a general tempest. What the event would be, God only knew, but some punishment seemed preparing for a people who were ungratefully abusing the best constitution any nation was ever blessed with, intent on nothing but luxury, licentiousness, power, places, pensions, and plunder. Meanwhile, the ministry, divided in their councils, with little regard for each other, worried by perpetual oppositions, in continual apprehension of changes, intent on securing popularity in case they should lose favor, had for some years past had little time to attend to great national interests, much less to our small American affairs, whose remoteness made them appear still smaller. The Court of King's Bench postponed giving sentence against Wilkes on his outlawry till the next term, intimidated, as some say, by his popularity and willing to get rid of the affair for a time till it should be seen what the Parliament would conclude as to his membership. His friends complained of it as a delay of justice, saying the court knew the outlawry to be defective and that they must finally pronounce it void, but would punish him by long confinement. Great mobs of his adherents assembled before the prison, and the guards fired on them. It is said 5 or 6 were killed and 15 or 16 wounded, and some circumstances attended this military execution, such as its being done by the Scotch regiment, the pursuing of a lad and killing him at his father's house, etc., etc., that exasperated people exceedingly, and more mischief seemed brewing. Several of the soldiers were imprisoned. It was said that English soldiers could not be confided in to act against these mobs, being suspected as rather inclined to favor and join them. By summer, the tumults and disorders were pretty well subsided. Wilkes's outlawry was reversed, but he was sentenced to 22 months' imprisonment and £1,000 fine, which his friends, who had feared he would be pilloried, seemed rather satisfied with. Later, in 1768, the visit of the King of Denmark engrossed all the conversation. That young monarch gained daily on the affections of England by his great affability and condescension, and the pleasure he appeared to take in everything he saw, and in every amusement and entertainment contrived for him. I had seen him at the Ridotto, and had no expectation of seeing him again, but in early October 1768 I received a very polite card from Baron Deed, his minister, expressing that the Prince of Travendall, the king's traveling name, desired much to make an acquaintance with me, and had ordered him to invite me to his table for Saturday at St. James's. I went accordingly, and was most graciously received. He was pleased to say he had long desired to see and converse with me. The questions he asked were such as showed an inquisitive mind and a good understanding. I was placed near him at table, only Lord Morton being between us, who was so good as to be my interpreter, I choosing not to speak in French, a language that I did not speak well at the time. On the one hand, there was a general disposition in the British nation to be upon good terms with the colonies and to leave us in the enjoyment of all our rights, and that no future impositions on America would be attempted. And yet this disposition was not to be relied on. There was a malice against us in some powerful people that discovered itself in all their expressions when they spoke to us, and thus prevented those healing measures that all good men wished to take place. Lord Hillsborough, the new Secretary of State, mentioned the farmers' letters to me, said he had read them, that they were well written, and he believed he could guess who was the author, looking in my face at the same time as if he thought it was me. He censured the doctrines as extremely wild, etc. The more I thought and read on the subject, however, the more I found myself confirmed in the opinion that no middle doctrine could be well maintained, that Parliament had a power to make all laws for us, or that it had a power to make no laws for us. And I thought the arguments for the latter more numerous and weighty than those of the former. In January 1771, at the earnest request of Mr. Strahan, I went to wait on Lord Hillsborough. I was shown into the levee room, and his lordship came toward me. I said that my business was not much, only to pay my respects to his lordship, and to acquaint him with my appointment by the House of Representatives of the province of Massachusetts Bay to be their agent there. But his lordship, whose countenance changed at my naming that province, cut me short by saying, with something of a smile and a sneer, "I must set you right there, Mr. Franklin. You are not an agent." "Why, my lord?" "You are not appointed." "I do not understand your lordship. I have the appointment in my pocket." "You are mistaken. I have a letter from Governor Hutchinson. He would not give his assent to the bill." "There was no bill, my lord. It is a vote of the House." "The House of Representatives has no right to appoint an agent. We shall take no notice of agents but such as are appointed by acts of assembly to which the governor gives his assent." "I cannot conceive, my lord, why the consent of the governor should be thought necessary to the appointment of an agent for the people." With a mixed look of anger and contempt, "I shall not enter into a dispute with you, sir, upon this subject. When I came into the administration of American affairs, I found them in great disorder. By my firmness they are now something mended, and while I have the honor to hold the seals, I shall continue the same conduct." "I beg your lordship's pardon for taking up so much of your time. It is, I believe, no great importance whether the appointment is acknowledged or not. For I have not the least conception that an agent can at present be any use to any of the colonies. I shall therefore give your lordship no further trouble. Withdraw." After this conference between the secretary and me, I heard that Lord Hillsborough had taken great offense at some of my last words, which he called extremely rude and abusive. He assured a friend of mine they were equivalent to telling him to his face that the colonies could expect neither favor nor justice during his administration. I found he did not mistake me. This conference was one of the many instances of the secretary's behavior and conduct that gave me the very mean opinion I entertained of his abilities and fitness for his station. His character was conceit, wrong-headedness, obstinacy, and passion. I had hoped, however, that our affairs would not much longer be perplexed and embarrassed by his perverse and senseless management. I did not pretend the gift of prophecy, but I thought one could clearly see in the system of customs exacted in America by Act of Parliament the seed sown of total disunion of the two countries. I wrote the following to the Massachusetts House of Representatives Committee of Correspondence in 1771. "The course and natural progress in England seems to be, first, the appointment of needy men as officers, for others do not care to leave England. Then their necessities make them rapacious, their office makes them proud and insolent, their insolence and rapacity make them odious, and, being conscious that they are hated, they become malicious. Their malice urges them to continual abuse of the inhabitants in their letters of administration, representing them as disaffected and rebellious, and, to encourage the use of severity, as weak, divided, timid, and cowardly. Government believes all, thinks it necessary to support and countenance its officers. Their quarreling with the people is deemed a mark and consequence of their fidelity. They are therefore more highly rewarded, and this makes their conduct still more insolent and provoking. The resentment of the people will, at times and on particular incidents, burst into outrages and violence upon such officers, and this naturally draws down severity and acts of further oppression from hence. The more the people are dissatisfied, the more rigor will be thought necessary. Severe punishments will be inflicted to terrify, rights and privileges will be abolished, great force will then be required to secure execution and submission. The expenses will become enormous. It will then be thought proper by fresh exactions to make the people defray it. Thence the British nation and government will become odious, and the subjections to it will be deemed no longer tolerable. War ensues, and the bloody struggle will end in absolute slavery to America or ruin to Britain by the loss of her colonies. The latter more probable from America's growing strength and magnitude. But, as the whole empire must in either case be greatly weakened, I cannot but wish to see much patience and the utmost discretion in our general conduct, that the fatal period may be postponed, and that, whenever this catastrophe shall happen, it may appear to all mankind that the fault has not been ours. History shows that by these steps great empires have crumbled heretofore, and the late transactions we have so much cause to complain of show that we are in the same train, and that, without a greater share of prudence and wisdom than we have seen both sides to be possessed of, we shall probably come to the same conclusion. Temple came home to us during the Christmas vacation from school. He seemed to improve continually, and more engaged the regard of all that were acquainted with him by his pleasing, sensible, manly behavior. I had debates with myself whether or not I would continue in London any longer. I grew homesick, and being in my 67th year, I began to apprehend some infirmity of age might attack me and make my return impracticable. I had also some important affairs to settle before my death, a period I thought at the time could not be far distant. I had indeed so many good friends in England that I could spend the remainder of my life among them with pleasure, if it were not for my American connections and the incredible affection I retained for that dear country from which I had so long been in a state of exile. We had a severe and tedious winter in England in 1771. By late April, there had not been yet the smallest appearance of spring. Not a bud had pushed out, nor a blade of grass. The turnips that used to feed the cattle had been destroyed by the frost. The hay in most parts of the country was gone, and the cattle were perishing for want, the lambs dying by thousands through cold and scanty nourishment. In May, I made with friends a journey of a fortnight to Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, and Birmingham, and returned in time to be at court on the King's birthday. My journey was of use to my health, the air and exercise giving me fresh spirits. In Manchester, we visited a school for poor boys and admired its old and well-stocked library, and then embarked in a luxurious horse-drawn boat on the Duke of Bridgewater's canal and followed it to its end in the Duke's coal mines. The last 1,000 yards to the first coal face were subterranean. We observed the miners at work in cramped quarters and watched the coal being brought out and loaded into a 40-ton canal boat, which a single horse then pulled to Manchester. There the canal again tunneled under a hill to a large hole running up to the surface, through which a water-driven crane unloaded the coal. The next morning we left Manchester and reached Leeds by evening. We visited the Cloth Hall at Leeds, where each subscriber had a booth for selling his wares on market days. The hall was then almost empty because of the demands of the American trade, which had raised the price by 6 pence a yard. We then called on Joseph Priestley, who made some very pretty electrical experiments and demonstrated some of the different properties of different kinds of air. The next day we arrived at Sheffield, where we went to see a factory making articles of silver-plated copper, and in the afternoon to inspect the ironworks and manufacture of tin plate at nearby Rotherham, and to visit an ironworks where we saw them melting the iron ore and casting pots, etc., which is performed as in America. The laborers received 14 pence per day. Their work was extremely hard, and in summertime must have been very disagreeable. The next day we came to Birmingham. On the morning we visited Matthew Bolton Soho Ironworks, which employed 700 people. Its products were extremely varied, from farthing buttons to 100-guinea ornaments. We went through his works, but there was not much, and we stayed so little that it was almost impossible for the strongest memory to retain it. The work of a button had 5 or 6 branches in it, each of which is performed in a second of time. He likewise worked plated goods, watch rings, and all kinds of hardware, all of which was performed by machinery in such a manner that children and women performed the greatest part of it. In June of 1771, I went out of town and spent a few days among the pleasing society of Reverend Shipley, the Bishop of St. Asaph, and his family. I returned home, breathing with reluctance the smoke of London and regretting my leaving the sweet air of Twyford. I promised myself the happiness of returning to that most agreeable retirement. In August, I spent 3 weeks of uninterrupted leisure in Hampshire at my friend's home, where I began writing the recollection of my life. The bishop's lady knew what children and grandchildren I had, their ages, etc. So when I was about to return to London, she insisted on my staying 1 day longer that we might together keep my grandson's birthday. At dinner, among other nice things, we had a floating island, which they always particularly had on the birthdays of any of their own 6 children, who were all but one at table, where there was also a clergyman's widow, then above 100 years old. The chief toast of the day was Master Benjamin Bache, to which the bishop's lady added, "that he might be as good a man as his grandfather." I said I hoped he would be much better. My wife sent to the bishop's family a fine, large gray squirrel from America, a favorite amusement that they called Mungo. Unfortunately, a year later, the squirrel got out of his cage and was rambling over a common 3 miles from home when he met a man with a dog. The dog pursuing him, the squirrel fled to the man for protection, running up to his shoulder, but the man shook him off and set the dog on him, thinking him to be, as he said afterwards, some varmint or other. So poor Mungo died and was buried in the garden. I lamented the loss of the squirrel with the Shipley children, and wrote the following epitaph, knowing that Skug is a common name by which all squirrels are called in England, as all cats are called puss. Here Skug lies snug as a bug in a rug.